Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is Sarah Jones with Politicus Radio. Joining me to talk about Republicans blaming President Obama and Senator Bernie Sanders for the violence at Trump rallies is Politicus USA's editor-in-chief, Jason Easley. Glad you could join us.
Thank you for having me on this fine Sunday.
It is a fine Sunday. With Trump rallies gaining notoriety for their violence, Republicans are playing their blame the Democrat card. Donald Trump started blaming Senator Bernie Sanders for the violence at his events falsely and with no proof, accusing Senator Sanders' campaign of organizing disruptions of his rallies. Today, Senator Ted Cruz, who is also running for president, number 2 after Donald Trump on the Republican side, blamed President Obama for the violence at Trump rallies, accusing the president of engaging in demagoguery in a classic Karl Rove case of accuse your opponent of what you are doing. Here's a snippet of the transcript from today. Ted Cruz. You know, Chuck Obama's a world-class demagogue. That language there is designed to divide us. Then there's a long bit that I'm cutting out. Moralizing from the president makes people angry. Chuck Todd. You think that's worse than what Donald Trump is doing? Senator Ted Cruz. To be honest, I think it's very much the same. They're both engaging in demagoguery. Republican strategists are pretending there's nothing to see here and we need to trust Donald Trump's heart, quote unquote. Meanwhile, the media refuses to call this what it is, and instead they are treating inciting racial violence as they treat climate change, something they just aren't sure about. Something that's up for debate. Your thoughts, Jason?
I think that we are seeing, as you pointed out, both the ridiculousness and logical conclusion of the treatment of Donald Trump with kid gloves by the media, and the Republican refusal to take responsibility for the years of rhetoric that they've used to divide this country and contest elections basically on racial terms. This is all coming home to roost, and everything that you just discussed in your opening was exactly why what happened in Chicago was bound to happen. It's bound to continue to happen.
Well, as you wrote the other day, I think it was yesterday, Rachel Maddow on MSNBC made a case that's indisputable. She laid out all of the sound bites, not all of them, but many of them, and they were time-stamped, of Donald Trump inciting violence and how his rhetoric has escalated. One of the things he said yesterday or the day before that really disturbed me was he went on about how these people are ruining the country. That's what he told his supporters. And then he had promised that he would pay the legal fees of anyone who was arrested for assault. And today he came out and said he might pay the legal fees of the
man in North Carolina
who assaulted the protester, who was a nonviolent protester who was being escorted out of the venue at the time. So there's no question that Donald Trump is inciting this violence, and he's doing it for political purposes. This point this is a fact. This is happening at his events. He also made a tour of cities that are known right now for racial tensions, and he's saying these horrible things, and then the media is saying, and I think Ted Cruz said this earlier, that people are mad at Obama. We've talked about this in an earlier podcast, and I said, how does that relate to being angry at random black people? So it's just more of this racism that we see where every person, they don't even realize that by saying something like that, it's exceptionally racist. Or maybe they do realize it and they're deliberately inciting people, but the media isn't holding them accountable for it.
The media is actually encouraging them by not challenging Trump, by not saying this is racist behavior. It's back to the same tired stuff with our mainstream press, and that they're so afraid of losing access to Trump or whoever it may be, Ted Cruz, that they won't confront these people with their behavior. Instead, they just act like you said, they play dumb. They act like this is something debatable. Well, whenever it's put out there in chronological order, the escalating rhetoric of Donald Trump and his own party's refusal to disavow his rhetoric and to stop him, or even better, don't give him a platform. If he's that dangerous, start cutting him out of the action. But they won't do that because then they're afraid Trump will run third party. So
they have no political courage. I mean, they'll do anything to excuse this. Today on Meet the Press, they are trying to say, look at what's in Donald Trump's heart. Look at his heart. Don't look at what he's doing. Don't look at what he's saying. Don't hold him responsible. Because in his heart, he's a good man. He doesn't have violence in his heart. There couldn't be a more fallacious argument to make, really. I mean, how can you go around, well, it's in my heart. We don't know what's in your heart. We can only see what you're doing and hold you responsible for your actions. It's just like we're all entitled to have our feelings, but you don't act on your feelings. This is something that children learn. Republicans are now reverting to the sort of moral code of a 2-year-old.
Also, I just thought of this, the in your heart argument. Doesn't that also mean it's fun? It's tricky because that means that, well, Donald Trump's a good guy, so there is no violence. But what if this has nothing to do with Donald Trump's heart? What if this is all, as you said, a strategic, calculated political decision to use violence as a political strategy and the threat of violence? What if this has nothing? Don't be dissuaded or confused or have the wool pulled over your eyes by talk about Republicans and hearts. This has nothing to do with heart and everything to do with practical political strategy. Right.
Well, Republicans always use hearts and God when they get busted doing something horrible. God has forgiven me. I've spoken to my pastor. This is between God and my family, blah, blah, blah. That's what they say when they get busted cheating on their wife or going to a prostitute. So these are the ways they distract people from what they're doing, is they try to make this into this emotional issue that nobody can say anything back to that. That's why we don't have divine authority in our elected officials in this country, because we need to be able to hold people accountable. And if you go back to God and say, God, said I'm okay, God says it's okay for me to do this, well, nobody can hold you accountable then. That's why we don't do it that way. But Republicans do. They do it that way. And this going, the servant's heart is another thing Republicans like to say. It's a Christian, kind of reference to Christianity, that you have a servant's heart. That's why you want to, that's why you're stealing money from people and having faux filibusters. And it's kind of a con. I mean, not to say that anyone who says they have a servant's heart is a con, but if you're a politician and you're using that as an excuse for your behavior, yes, that's a con.
I wanted to ask you, can you think of anything more ridiculous than the idea that Bernie Sanders supporters are causing violence at Donald Trump rallies?
That was the really horrifying thing about this. Of all the people to pick on, and he called Bernie Sanders a communist, to pick on Bernie Sanders, who has been in office for so long, has this long record of, this is a man with dignity and decorum, and who treats even his opponents with respect. He conducts himself just with the utmost integrity. He is a responsible person. He is an ethical person. There are no sort of scandals coming out of his background because he conducts himself really well. To accuse him, to hold him responsible for violence when, yes, his rhetoric, and that's what they've been trying to make this false conflation for a long time. The media has, and now, because it benefits Republicans to act like Bernie Sanders is the opposite of Donald Trump. That's certainly not the case at all. And when Bernie Sanders says he wants a political revolution, and he's careful to use that word, he doesn't say revolution, he doesn't say go out in the streets, get a gun, hurt these people, they're not worth something. He is saying, he is holding the people who have the money and the power accountable. He is saying, go hold them accountable. That is actually the premise of democracy. That's what Bernie Sanders is doing. He is not inciting racial violence. He is holding the top 2% of this country accountable. He is telling his supporters to hold them accountable, just like they're supposed to. That's how this country is supposed to work. He's taking people back to the roots of this country, and it makes Republicans really uncomfortable. And so they're, in order to make what Donald Trump is doing okay, they're conflating the two. They're not the same. They're not extremist. there's, young people today think that socialism is a good value system. So Republicans can keep trying to make that argument, but it's just, it's actually really offensive why don't you take responsibility? This isn't happening at Bernie Sanders' rallies. How come there isn't violence happening at his rallies? He doesn't tell people, I'm going to go pay your legal fees if you go beat up the people who oppose me. I mean, that's how immature Donald Trump is.
And the funny thing is, I guess the idea of a roaming band of Hillary Clinton thugs didn't sound authentically fictional enough for Trump to use Hillary thugs. But to me, and I wrote this yesterday, I'm just trying to picture this, like people in Hillary Clinton t-shirts running around, or Bernie Sanders t-shirts running around beating up Donald Trump supporters. But that's the fantasy he is selling.
Right.
But what I wrote yesterday was, this is all actually a strategy. The use of the word communist, the idea of Bernie Sanders is backed by union thugs who are coming to Trump rallies, and it's all part of Trump's strategy, if Sanders would be the nominee, to paint Bernie Sanders as the great red menace.
Right. Well, that's what they would do. And but the thing is, this is what really bothers me about the mainstream media. Here are the facts of what happened with the fellow who was sucker punched repeatedly. Donald Trump is trying to say, and he did say, that was justifiable because the man flipped people the bird. In what world does flipping someone off mean it's okay for you to punch them? See, those two things, that isn't okay. That's the reasoning of a 2-year-old. But the media has bought into that to some extent, or they wouldn't be asking who the racist is here. So, yes, what Donald Trump is really saying is, when you use your freedom of speech and your freedom of expression, you deserve to be violently taken down. How is that democracy?
When you disagree with Donald Trump, you deserve to be punched in the face.
Yeah, repeatedly.
Yeah.
Sucker punched while you're being escorted out by security. White security, who, by the way, don't do anything, at least on camera, to the man who actually punched this African-American protester.
Yeah, nobody grabbed the dude that did the punching.
No, they just let him do it.
Him.
And so here you have, who is inciting racial violence to accuse. Now, let's go back to what Ted Cruz said, because this really got my goat. I have to say, I might be sick right now, but
Lying Ted
can still rile me up and get me out of my sick bed. Ted Cruz said that President Obama moralizing about this issue is what's causing violence. My first reaction to that is, Republicans can't stand that President Obama has been the leader, the moral leader this country has so desperately needed for so long. He has no scandals. He does lift up the country. He does hold people to a higher standard. He does unify people. Just because the little angry Archies in the Republican Party don't hear that higher call and can't respond to it because they're so full of anger, doesn't mean that President Obama is doing something wrong. That's in there. They should look to their hearts. They should look into their little servant hearts and wonder why they can't hear this uplifting call to become one with their fellow Americans. And number two, if Ted Cruz gets so angry because President Obama is moralizing, he might want to ask himself why. Because I suspect, based on my psychology degree, whatever limited sort of authority that gives me, and it's pretty small, but I'm going to pretend that it's bigger than that right now, because it looks so much to me as if Ted Cruz gets angry about that because Obama's right. And they don't have an answer for it. Republicans used to be the moral party. And now President Obama, a black man, is lecturing them. That's how they see it. When he's actually trying to give everyone moral codes with which they should, measure their own behavior by, which they can live by.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond, as you said, the typical Republican knee-jerk reaction to blame Obama. This is something a whole lot deeper. This is as you said, Republicans seething with jealousy because Obama is actually everything they claimed